Did ancient Egyptians really believe in mummy curses? Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we step softly into the shifting sands of ancient Egypt, a land where stone monuments rose higher than belief, and whispers of the afterlife shaped every detail of daily life. This is not just history, it is mystery. And it is a mystery that has lingered for more than a century in the Western imagination. Did the ancient Egyptians truly believe in mummy curses? You may have heard the stories. Archaeologists opening tombs and soon falling ill. Financiers of great expeditions meeting untimely deaths. A warning carved in hieroglyphs, those intricate, pictorial symbols of the Egyptian language that seem to echo from the walls of dark burial chambers. But what if I told you that the truth behind these tales is far more complicated and far more fascinating? Across 5 chapters, we will wander carefully through history. We will trace how the idea of the mummy's curse began, how the Egyptians themselves viewed the sacred balance between the living and the dead, and how modern science has weighed in on the mysteries. Along the way, we will meet kings, priests, explorers, and skeptics, and you will see how one legend became woven into the very fabric of our fascination with ancient Egypt. So settle in. Let your curiosity stay awake while the rest of you slowly drifts toward rest. And remember, the deeper we go, the more the line between fact and legend begins to blur. Chapter 1, Part 1. The Whisper in the Sand. Our story begins not in ancient times, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, a period sometimes called the Golden Age of Egyptology. This was the age when European explorers and archaeologists scoured the desert sands in search of treasures buried beneath. To them, the Valley of the Kings was not only a cemetery, but a doorway into fame and fortune. The world's attention focused most sharply in 1922, when the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, a young king whose burial chamber had remained almost completely intact for over 3,000 years. Newspapers at the time called it the greatest archaeological find in history. But along with golden masks and jeweled daggers came whispers of a curse. Not long after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy patron who had financed the expedition, died suddenly. His death was caused by an infected mosquito bite, but the press of the day was quick to connect it with something far more sinister. Journalists wrote that an inscription at the tomb warned, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs." The peace of the king. Was such an inscription really there? The answer, surprisingly, is no. Egyptologists today will tell you that no such words were ever carved on the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. Yet the story spread like wildfire across Europe and America because it fed perfectly into the imaginations of people who already associated Egypt with mystery, danger, and the supernatural. But to understand whether the Egyptians themselves believed in curses, we must look back much further than the age of Carter and Carnarvon. We must look to the ancient texts, the prayers written on papyrus scrolls, and the rituals performed by priests thousands of years earlier. The Egyptians had no word for curse in the sense we think of it, a spell designed to harm intruders. What they did have, however, were protections, both magical and practical, that surrounded the dead. One example is the so-called execration texts. These were ritual writings in which the names of Egypt's enemies were inscribed on clay figurines or shards of pottery, and then smashed or buried. The purpose was symbolic destruction, ensuring that those enemies would be powerless in the real world. Imagine writing your rival's name on a doll and then breaking it in two, believing that by doing so, you harm not just the doll, but the person themselves. This practice reveals the Egyptian belief in the power of words and symbols, a belief that lies at the very heart of their culture. And so, when we hear whispers of mummy curses, we are not entirely wrong to think the Egyptians believed in unseen powers. But their concerns were not aimed at journalists or tourists thousands of years in the future. Their rituals were meant to protect the sacred body of the dead and to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. For them, disturbing a tomb was not simply trespassing. It was interfering with eternity itself. As we move deeper into Chapter 1, we will explore the sacred role of the tomb, the function of priests, and why Egyptians went to extraordinary lengths to guard the journey of the soul. But for now, let the image linger. A golden tomb sealed for millennia, broken open in the dim light of lanterns, while the desert wind outside carries a whisper that might be nothing, or might be something more. Chapter 1, Part 2. The tomb as a portal. To the ancient Egyptians, a tomb was never just a place to store a body. It was a carefully engineered portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Every wall, every inscription, every sealed jar of food had a purpose. Imagine walking through a tomb corridor carved into the rock. The air is heavy, still and cold, even beneath the desert sun. On the walls, painted scenes tell the story of the deceased's journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The Duat was not a simple hell or heaven. It was a vast, complex realm filled with gates, guardians, and trials. To pass through it, the soul called the Ka and Ba, aspects of spiritual existence, needed protection, guidance, and magic. This is where hieroglyphs came alive. The so-called spells carved on the walls or written on papyrus scrolls weren't meant to scare away future explorers. They were instructions, almost like a cosmic travel guide, teaching the soul how to navigate the Duat, how to speak the right words at the right gate, how to defend itself against demons or serpents that might try to block the path. And here is where we see the subtle difference between what we call a curse and what the Egyptians considered protection. To the Egyptians, words themselves had power. This concept is called hika, a term that translates loosely as magic. But in their worldview, it was more than tricks or superstition. Heka was the natural force that connected gods, humans, and the unseen world. Writing a warning on a tomb wall wasn't empty superstition. It was activating Heka, binding reality with sacred language. Archaeologists have found inscriptions that read things like, "He who shall enter here without right shall not see life again." At first glance, that sounds like a curse. But in context, it's more like a spiritual boundary, just as we put locks on doors or signs that say, "Do not enter." It was meant to guard the eternal rest of the dead, not to punish curious adventurers centuries later. Yet, can you imagine being one of those adventurers? You're deep underground, the flickering flame of your torch is the only light, and you stumble across words written 3,000 years ago telling you that you will die if you trespass. Even if you don't believe in magic, a chill would run down your spine. And that chill, that moment of unease, is precisely where the idea of the mummy's curse took root. So, while Western newspapers in the 1920s turned these warnings into sensational headlines, the truth is quieter, more profound. The Egyptians weren't threatening the living. They were protecting the dead. To them, disturbing the tomb wasn't just theft. It was a disruption of cosmic order, an act that could ripple through both worlds. And in that silence, under the weight of stone and centuries, the whisper of the curse grew louder. Chapter 1, Part 3. Protectors of the dead. If a tomb was a portal, then the guardians of that portal were not just stone and paint. They were human too. In ancient Egypt, priests held the responsibility of ensuring that the dead received the rituals needed to pass safely into the afterlife. These men, sometimes working for years to prepare a burial, understood the tomb as a sacred trust, not merely a resting place. The most important ritual was the opening of the mouth ceremony, performed just before the burial. This rite symbolically restored the deceased's senses: sight, hearing, taste, and breath. so that the soul could live again in the afterlife. A priest, often wearing a jackal mask to represent Anubis, the god of embalming and protector of graves, would touch a ritual blade or wand to the lips of the mummy. In that moment, the dead was no longer silent, but ready to speak and eat in the world beyond Dot. To break into a tomb and disturb a body, then, was not simply robbery. It was a violation of that priestly work and a spiritual crime against the deceased. And the Egyptians understood such acts to bring consequences, not because of a ghostly curse floating in the air, but because it disturbed Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance. In Egyptian thought, everything from the flooding of the Nile to the rising of the sun was tied to Ma'at. If balance was broken, the world itself could fall into chaos. This is where we begin to see the roots of what would later be exaggerated as the curse. Imagine a world where every natural disaster, every sudden illness, every misfortune could be interpreted as punishment for disturbing the dead. If a villager broke into a tomb and his crops later failed, neighbors might whisper that the gods had struck him down. Over centuries, these whispers would grow into legends. There were also physical guardians. Tombs were often sealed with plaster and stone, their entrances hidden beneath sand. Some even contained simple traps, false passages, heavy stones meant to collapse, or narrow shafts designed to discourage intruders. To the Egyptians, these weren't curses but deterrents, practical ways to keep robbers out. Yet to an outsider, stumbling upon these defenses, the line between human trickery and supernatural warning blurred. And let us not forget the imagery. Statues of jackals, cobras carved into doorways, painted figures of deities holding knives. To modern eyes, these look like works of art. But to someone entering by torchlight, surrounded by silence and shadows, they were terrifying presences. A jackal god staring from the wall feels very much like a warning. Even if no words are spoken, by the end of the Old Kingdom, tomb inscriptions became more elaborate. Protective spells were etched not just for the soul's journey, but to guard against intrusion. Here, finally, we begin to see phrases that could be interpreted as curses, words calling down harm on those who disturb the sacred sleep of the dead. Not all tombs had them, but enough existed to plant seeds of fear. So while the curse of the mummy that filled newspapers in the 1920s was largely a Western invention, its roots trace back to something older, the Egyptians' profound respect for death, their priests' careful rituals, and the enduring belief that words, images, and symbols held the power to shape reality. And as we close chapter 1, the image grows clearer. Tombs were not silent. They spoke through stone, through symbol, through ritual. To those who dared to listen, they warned, not with sensational curses, but with the steady voice of a civilization that believed eternity itself was worth protecting. Chapter 2, Part 1. When the West discovered the curse, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe and America were gripped by what newspapers called Egyptomania. Museums displayed mummies to fascinated crowds. Novels used Egyptian magic as a plot device, and wealthy collectors purchased artifacts with little thought for the culture they were taken from. To the Western imagination, Egypt was not just an ancient civilization, it was a land of mystery, darkness, and danger. When Howard Carter uncovered the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922, this obsession reached a fever pitch. Tutankhamun, or simply King Tut, was a minor pharaoh in life, but his death transformed him into one of the most famous figures in history. Why? Because his tomb was almost completely intact, unlike most others, which had been looted centuries earlier. Tut's burial chamber was sealed and filled with golden treasures, but soon after the tomb was opened, strange events seemed to unfold. The most famous was the sudden death of Lord Carnarvon, the aristocrat who had financed the expedition. He died of an infected mosquito bite that turned septic something common at a time before antibiotics were widely used. Yet to the newspapers, this was no ordinary death. British and American papers ran headlines like, "Pharaoh's Curse Claims First Victim and Death Walks in Tut's Tomb." They reported that Carter's canary had been eaten by a cobra, the symbol of the Egyptian crown, on the very day the tomb was unsealed. Some even claimed that a power outage struck Cairo at the moment Carnarvon died, plunging the city into eerie darkness. Were these events coincidences? Almost certainly. But in the public imagination, they confirmed what many already wanted to believe. The disturbing of Pharaoh's rest brought supernatural consequences. The fact that Carter himself lived another 16 years in perfect health was quietly ignored. And here is the irony. The ancient Egyptians did not leave a curse on Tutankhamun's tomb. No inscription warned intruders of death. Yet the legend of the curse grew precisely because it fit perfectly into the mood of the time. People were already primed by centuries of Gothic literature, ghost stories, and fascination with the exotic East. Egypt, with its strange gods and endless desert sands, was the perfect stage for a tale of vengeance from beyond the grave. In truth, what happened in those years was less about ancient Egyptian belief and more about Western storytelling. Newspapers sold more copies by printing tales of curses. Authors wrote thrilling novels of resurrected mummies. Hollywood soon joined in, releasing films that cemented the image of the mummy's curse into popular culture. But while the modern world played with fantasy, real archaeologists began looking more closely at the actual inscriptions and artifacts. And what they discovered in tomb after tomb was not a threat, but something more subtle: warnings of spiritual imbalance, invocations of gods, and rituals to protect the journey of the dead. The curse, then, was less a matter of Egyptian magic, and more a reflection of how the West projected its own fears onto the sands of Egypt. Still, even knowing this, one question remains. Why do so many stories of sudden deaths and strange illnesses follow in the wake of tomb discoveries? Was it truly coincidence? Or is there something more tangible at work, hidden beneath the sands? Chapter 2, Part 2. Science in the Shadows. If we set aside newspaper headlines and whispered legends, we are left with a more practical question. Why did so many who entered ancient tombs report illness, misfortune, or even death? Could there be something hidden in the darkness of those chambers? Something not supernatural, but natural? Modern researchers have suggested several possibilities. One of the most compelling involves toxic molds and bacteria. Imagine a tomb sealed tightly for more than 3,000 years. Inside, organic matter, linen wrappings, food offerings, even the body itself, slowly decomposed. In that stagnant air, microorganisms thrived. Scientists have identified strains of Aspergillus flavus and Stachybotrys chartarum, molds that can produce dangerous mycotoxins. Inhaling these spores in a poorly ventilated tomb could trigger respiratory problems, fevers, and in weakened individuals, even death. Another theory points to bacteria like Pseudomonas and Streptococcus. Some of these microbes can survive for astonishing lengths of time, dormant until disturbed. A cut on the skin, a weakened immune system, even a mosquito bite, as in Lord Carnarvon's case, could give these ancient hitchhikers the chance to invade. And then there is arsenic and lead dust. Pigments used on tomb walls and coffins sometimes contain heavy metals. Disturb the walls, brush away the sand, and invisible particles filled the air. In the early 20th century, when explorers had no protective equipment, breathing such dust could quietly poison the body over weeks or months. To the Egyptians, of course, this was not science as we know it. But they believed deeply in the unseen forces of the world forces that could harm or protect. In a strange way, their concept of Heka, the magical power that infused words and rituals, echoes our modern idea of invisible pathogens. Both recognize that the unseen has power. Both admit that stepping into a tomb is not without risk. And so, when death followed the breaking of a seal, it may not have been a vengeful pharaoh striking down intruders. It may have been something smaller, quieter, and deadlier, a microbe waiting patiently in the dark. But here lies the mystery's charm. People rarely fear bacteria, but they do fear curses. A headline about toxic spores in Tut's tomb would never have sold as many papers as death comes on swift wings. And so the scientific explanations, though compelling, never captured the imagination in the way that a supernatural curse did. Yet even today, archaeologists entering tombs take precautions. Ventilation, protective masks, careful handling of organic remains, all are part of standard practice. Not because they believe in curses, but because they respect the unseen dangers sealed away for millennia. The line between myth and reality, between curse and science, becomes ever thinner. And as we peer deeper into these shadows, we realize something haunting. Perhaps the Egyptians were right, in their own way. The dead do not rest quietly. They guard their tombs with powers invisible, whether we call them magic or microbes. Chapter 2, Part 3. The birth of a legend in popular culture. By the time Lord Carnarvon's death made headlines in 1923, the curse of the mummy had already taken root in the public's imagination. But it was not the archaeologists, nor the Egyptians themselves, who breathed life into this legend. It was storytellers, journalists, novelists, and eventually filmmakers who transformed whispers into a roaring myth. Western fascination with Egypt was already centuries old. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 had introduced Europe to its monuments in a spectacular way. Soon after, writers like Louisa May Alcott and Bram Stoker were weaving Egyptian curses into their novels. In Alcott's forgotten short story, Lost in a Pyramid, 1869, explorers unleash supernatural vengeance after burning a mummy. In Stoker's The Jewel of Seven Stars, 1903, an archaeologist brings home the mummy of an ancient queen, only to awaken a terrifying force. These stories predated Tutankhamun's discovery, but they primed readers to expect danger lurking in the desert sands. When Carnarvon died, journalists knew exactly how to frame the story. It was as if fiction had stepped into reality. Newspapers across Britain and America printed lurid tales of the pharaoh's revenge, often inventing details or twisting facts. Even scientists who dismissed curses could not silence the public's hunger for mystery. And then came Hollywood. In 1932, Universal Pictures released The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. The film told the story of Imhotep, a resurrected high priest, seeking to reunite with his lost love. Wrapped in linen, moving stiffly in the shadows, Karloff's mummy became an icon of horror. The movie never mentioned Tutankhamun by name, but audiences immediately connected it to the cursed stories. From that moment, the mummy was no longer a sacred figure of Egyptian culture. It was a monster of Western imagination. Over the decades, the image only grew. Sequels, remakes, and parodies from Abbott and Costello meet The Mummy 2. The Mummy franchise of the late 1990s cemented the idea that disturbing an ancient tomb would bring about doom. The real Egyptians had intended tombs as portals to eternity. Hollywood turned them into haunted houses. And yet, behind the costumes and special effects, something true remained. The fear of entering forbidden spaces. The unease of disturbing the dead. The sense that the past still holds power over us. These feelings kept the legend alive long after archaeologists dismissed it as superstition. So while microbes may explain some deaths, and while no tomb has ever yielded a carved warning of swift death to intruders, the curse lived on not in the sands of Egypt, but in the stories we told each other. It became part of Western folklore, a ghost born not from ancient hieroglyphs, but from modern printing presses and silver screens. As we leave Chapter 2 behind, we see clearly how the mummy's curse was less an Egyptian reality and more a Western invention. But to truly grasp the mystery, we must return to the heart of ancient belief itself. For in the words of the Egyptians, carved in stone and painted in gold, lies a vision of death and eternity unlike any other civilization. And that is where our journey takes us next. Chapter 3, Part 1. Words that guard eternity. To understand whether the Egyptians truly believed in curses, we must enter their spiritual world. And that world was not built on fear. It was built on preparation. For them, death was not an ending. It was a journey. Imagine standing in the flickering torchlight of a tomb, its walls alive with color. Painted figures of gods, demons, and spirits stretch across the stone, while rows of hieroglyphs march beside them. These are not decorations. They are instructions. Every symbol, every prayer, every offering was meant to help the soul make its way through the vast underworld. The most famous collection of these writings is what we call today the Book of the Dead. That name, coined by 19th century scholars, makes it sound like a grim catalog. In truth, the Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was a guidebook for the soul, a map of spells, hymns, and passwords. If the deceased spoke the right words, they could pass safely through the gates of the afterlife. But here's the secret. These texts were also defenses. Some spells warned intruders not to harm the tomb. Others invoked gods like Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian, or Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of wrath, to punish anyone who desecrated the burial. These are the closest things we find to what we might call curses. Not a vague threat of bad luck, but a divine warning. Do not disturb the eternal journey of the dead, or the gods themselves will respond to modern ears. It may sound superstitious, but to Egyptians it was logical. They lived in a world where the power of sacred words was as real as fire or water. Writing was not just communication. It was creation. To carve a spell into stone was to make it live. And if a spell promised protection from thieves, then that protection was as real as the tomb wall itself. We must also remember that tomb robbery was a constant fear. Gold, jewelry, and fine linen were buried with the dead, tempting the poor and the desperate. The protective text served a double purpose: to defend spiritually, but also to frighten off intruders with the threat of divine punishment. In this sense, they were not so different from the signs we post today. Beware of dog, or trespassers will be prosecuted. Only in Egypt, the guard dog might be a god of war, and the punishment eternal god. And so, when we ask whether Egyptians believed in mummy curses, the answer is both yes and no. They did not believe in curses as Hollywood imagined them, phantoms hunting explorers across continents. But they did believe that words had power, that tombs were sacred, and that disturbing them could unbalance the order of the cosmos. In their world, protection and punishment were two sides of the same coin. As our journey through Chapter 3 continues, we will look closer at specific spells, real inscriptions that scholars have translated, and how these texts shaped both Egyptian religion and the fears of those who entered their tombs thousands of years later. For now, hold the image in your mind. A silent chamber sealed in darkness, its walls whispering in painted words. Words that guard eternity. Words that might have been meant not just for the soul of the dead, but for anyone reckless enough to break their rest. Chapter 3, Part 2. Voices from the Stone. Picture yourself inside a tomb, lantern in hand, the flame trembling as if nervous of the silence. You run your fingers along the carved stone. At first, the hieroglyphs look like frozen art hawks, eyes, scarabs, twisted reeds. But then you realize these are not images. They are voices. They are words that were meant to be heard. One of the most striking examples comes from the tomb of Anktifi, a governor during Egypt's first intermediate period. Around 2100 BCE on his walls we find a warning. Anyone who shall do evil against my tomb, the crocodile shall be against him in water, the snake against him on land. He who shall do this, I shall seize his neck like a bird. It is the gods who will judge. To us, it reads like a curse. To Anktifi, it was protection and eternal insurance policy, calling upon the natural world and the divine to defend his rest. Another inscription, found in a different burial, warns intruders with almost legal precision. He who enters this tomb, impure, unclean, or guilty, he shall never exist, and his body shall not rest in the earth. His soul shall be damned for all eternity. Notice the language. It doesn't promise falling rocks or sudden death. Instead, it threatens something worse to an Egyptian mind: the destruction of the soul, the denial of eternity. For them, to erase the chance of afterlife was the ultimate punishment. And then there are the more poetic texts. On some tomb walls, we find words that appeal directly to visitors. O you who love life and hate death, do not harm this tomb. Respect it, and your own children will flourish. Attack it, and you will meet the fate you deserve. Here we see both carrot and stick promises of blessing for respect, curses for violation. These were not horror stories, but moral reminders. Disturb the order of the dead, and you disturb the order of your own life. Scholars sometimes call these writings threat formulas. They appear sporadically across Egyptian history, most common during periods of social unrest when tomb robbery was a real danger. But to the Egyptians, they were more than words. They were Heka-activated magic. Just as a key opens a lock, these words locked the tomb against Trespasser stud. Imagine the effect centuries later. A 19th century archaeologist or looter, barely able to read the symbols, might catch only fragments. Death. Neck, damned for eternity. In the quiet darkness, such words would echo louder than thunder. A simple formula meant for protection became, in foreign eyes, a deadly curse. And this is the paradox. The Egyptians did not fear these texts, they trusted them. But outsiders, standing on unfamiliar ground, saw only menace. A mirror of belief. What one culture saw as sacred reassurance, another saw as supernatural terror. As chapter 3 continues, we will explore not only these texts, but also the gods who stood behind them, the divine guardians invoked to protect tombs. For in Egypt, every word had a protector, and every curse had a god's face behind it. Chapter 3, Part 3. Gods who guard the dead. If the protective spells carved on tomb walls were the locks, then the gods were the guardians who stood. Watch at the gates of eternity. To the Egyptians, no curse or blessing existed on its own. Every word of power, every ritual, drew its strength from a divine presence. The most familiar guardian is Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Anubis was the patron of embalmers, the one who oversaw mummification. In countless tomb paintings, he appears, bending over the body of the deceased, wrapping the linen with careful hands. But Anubis was more than a gentle guide. He was a protector. In magical texts, his very image was thought to terrify tomb robbers. To steal from a grave was to invite the wrath of the jackal, who prowled both desert sands and the afterlife itself. Then, there was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague. Fierce and unpredictable, she was often invoked to defend sacred places. One inscription warns that Sekhmet would strike down violators with fiery breath and disease. For the Egyptians, this was not a metaphor. They believed illness itself could be the weapon of a god, sent as punishment for impiety. In modern terms, we might see bacteria and toxins. But to them, the invisible hand behind sickness was divine. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, also appears in protective contexts. Known as the scribe of the gods, he was believed to record every action of humans. Tomb warnings sometimes invoked. Thoth to bear witness against intruders, ensuring that their crimes would be noted and judged in the divine court. To rob a tomb, then, was not only theft, it was a crime permanently entered into the cosmic record. And above them all loomed Osiris, lord of the underworld. Every tomb, in a sense, belonged to him, for the deceased hoped to join Osiris in eternal life. To violate a tomb was to challenge Osiris himself, and few things could sound more terrifying to an ancient Egyptian ear. Together, these gods formed a spiritual security system more fearsome than any locks or guards. Their images painted on walls, their names carved in stone, were living presences. For Egyptians, invoking a god was not just symbolic. It was literal. To write, "Anubis will seize your heart," was to invite Anubis to act. Now imagine again the experience of a foreign explorer. He steps into a narrow passage and sees painted jackals, lions, and hawks staring back at him. He cannot read the hieroglyphs, but he feels their weight. The silence seems filled with watchful eyes. In that moment, even a rational man might shiver. Was it imagination, or was it something more? What's fascinating is that these divine guardians echo the very elements of the curse we know today. Sudden death, illness, judgment after trespassing. Each has a root in Egyptian belief. The difference is that the Egyptians trusted these powers to protect, while the modern West feared them as threats. And so, by listening to the voices of the gods, we find a truth hidden behind the myth. Yes, the Egyptians believed in forces that could punish the desecrator of a tomb. But those forces were not blind curses. They were divine justice, carried out by gods who guarded the fragile boundary between life and eternity. As chapter 3 draws to a close, one question lingers. Did the Egyptians believe these protections always worked? Or were there moments when even gods could not stop human greed? To answer, then, we must follow the robbers themselves, those who dared to defy the warnings and suffered the consequences. Chapter 3, Part 4. The Tomb Robber's Fate, for all the spells, warnings, and divine guardians painted on the walls. One truth haunted ancient Egypt. Tomb robbery was common. The treasures buried with the dead were too tempting, especially in times of famine or political collapse. Gold, fine linen, alabaster jars. These were not just offerings to the gods. To the poor, they were survival. To the desperate, they were worth the risk. We know this not only because of damaged tombs, but because the Egyptians themselves recorded the crimes. In the village of Dar el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs of the Valley of the King's papyrus scrolls preserve trial records from around 1100 BCE. These are the Tomb Robbery Papyrus, a series of legal documents that read like courtroom dramas frozen in time. One robber confesses, "We entered by tunneling. We broke the seals. We found the noble mummy of the king. We took his gold, his amulets, and his coffins. We burned the wrappings. We divided the treasure." There is no poetry here, no reverence, only blunt testimony. Yet the punishment was severe. Some robbers were executed, others mutilated. Their names were branded as criminals for eternity. In Egyptian eyes, they had not just broken a law, they had disturbed the cosmic balance, violated Maat, and invited divine wrath. And here is where we glimpse the psychological weight of the curse. Imagine being a poor worker, slipping into a tomb by night, chiseling through stone, knowing the walls whispered of snakes, jackals, and gods waiting in judgment. Even if you did not die immediately, would you ever truly feel safe again? Would Every cough, every accident, every failed harvest feel like Sekhmet's vengeance. Some ancient graffiti supports this idea. On certain tomb walls, scribbled later by intruders, we find crude note signs of fear, as if the robbers themselves needed to talk back to the gods, leaving marks to mock or plead. Their writings are desperate reminders that even those who took gold could not take peace of mind. So, while curses may not have struck intruders down like lightning, they worked in another way, through belief. The fear of punishment, whether divine or social, was real enough to haunt those who broke the seals. And when stories of robbery spread, they only deepened the aura of dangers surrounding the tombs. Thus, the curse was not simply carved in stone. It was carved into the minds of both Egyptians and, centuries later, the Westerners who rediscovered their graves. And with that, Chapter 3 closes. We have walked through spells, gods, and the fate of robbers, and we see how the Egyptians truly thought about curses. They were not ghost stories, they were justice. Yet, as history shows us, justice often takes strange forms. Now, as we turn to Chapter 4, the story moves forward in time again. Archaeologists, scientists, and skeptics will weigh in, trying to explain once and for all whether the mummies' curse is myth, magic, or something in between. But even in the age of reason, the whisper of the curse will not go away. Chapter 4, Part 1. Science versus the supernatural. By the 20th century, the legend of the mummy's curse had spread far beyond Egypt's sands. Newspapers, novels, and films turned whispers into worldwide fascination. Yet not everyone was content with mystery. Scientists and doctors began to ask, if so many people claimed the curse was real, could there be a natural explanation? Medical journals from the 1920s and 1930s took the idea seriously. One doctor wrote that Carnarvon's death after opening Tutankhamun's tomb was likely septicemia aggravated by exhaustion. In plain words, infection and stress. But others suggested that sealed tombs were breeding grounds for microbial hazards. Researchers examined ancient wrappings and discovered traces of toxic molds, like Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus. These fungi produce spores that, when inhaled, can cause fever, coughing, and in vulnerable people, organ failure. In the silence of a sealed chamber, what felt like a supernatural presence may have been invisible clouds of poison. Another theory emerged in the 1970s, radioactive elements. Some archaeologists proposed that Egyptian priests may have intentionally used naturally radioactive materials to discourage grave robbers. There is little direct evidence for this, but the theory lingers because uranium and radon gas exist in certain Egyptian rock formations. To stumble into such a chamber without protection could indeed be deadly. But perhaps the most intriguing scientific explanation involves psychology. The early 20th century was a time of deep superstition. Explorers entering a tomb by lantern, light already primed by Gothic novels and newspaper headlines, carried fear in their minds. Psychologists call this the nocebo effect, the opposite of placebo. If you believe something will harm you, your body can manifest real symptoms: nausea, weakness, even heart problems. In this sense, the mummy's curse may have been not just a story, but a powerful psychological trap. And yet, science could not fully explain away the coincidences. Dozens of people who entered Tutankhamun's tomb lived long, healthy lives, including Howard Carter himself. But others, Carnarvon, his relatives, even a few journalists did die early or strangely. Was it microbes, bad luck, or something else? Skeptics argue we only notice the deaths that fit the story. It is a form of confirmation bias. We see what we expect to see. When one man dies, it becomes proof of the curse. When 10 others live, it becomes silence. Still, the debate lingers. For while science brings clarity, it does not erase mystery. The tomb remains a space of shadows, and shadows invite stories. As we continue in Chapter 4, we will see how archaeology and modern technology have reshaped our understanding of Egypt. CT scans of mummies, DNA analysis, and new translations of texts all give us sharper answers. Yet even with the tools of reason, the question remains, why does the legend refuse to die? Chapter 4, Part 2. Peering inside the tombs with science, the legend of the mummy's curse lingers. But the tools we use to explore the past have changed dramatically. Where once adventurers carried lanterns and chisels, today archaeologists carry laptops, scanners, and sterile gloves. And with these tools, they have begun to answer questions that mystery alone could never solve. Take the case of Tutankhamun himself. For decades, speculation swirled around his death. Was he murdered by a blow to the head? Poisoned by rivals? Punished by a curse for disturbing tradition? Theories multiplied, each more sensational than the last. But in 2005, a team of scientists used a CT scan, a series of X-ray images assembled into a 3D model, to examine the boy king's remains without unwrapping them. What they found was not murder. Instead, Tutankhamun suffered from a broken leg, likely the result of an accident combined with malaria. In an age without antibiotics, either could be fatal. The curse of Tut, it seemed, was less about magic and more about the fragile nature of human life in the Bronze Age. DNA testing has also revealed new truths. Studies of royal mummies show evidence of congenital disorders, diseases passed down through generations of intermarriage in the royal family. These discoveries paint a picture of pharaohs not as untouchable gods, but as mortals vulnerable to the same weaknesses as any of us thought. And what about the supposed curse texts themselves? Advances in epigraphy, the careful recording and translation of inscriptions, show that most were not threats at all. Instead, they were prayers, invocations for protection, reminders of offerings, or appeals to the gods. The few that read, like curses, were meant as spiritual defenses, never universal death sentences. Yet even as technology dispels myths, it creates new mysteries. In some sealed tombs, instruments detect traces of ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide toxic gases released from ancient materials. Were these chemical traps intentional, set by priests who knew how to harness natural dangers? Or are they accidents of time and chemistry? The answer is still uncertain. In this way, modern archaeology straddles the line between science and legend. It confirms that no ghostly hand strikes down intruders, but it also reminds us that tombs are dangerous places, filled with unseen hazards. Perhaps that is why even today, some archaeologists speak with quiet respect before entering a new chamber, as if acknowledging the weight of thousands of years pressing in around them. Technology can measure bones, trace DNA, and decode inscriptions, but it cannot erase the feeling, the hush that falls in a tomb, the flicker of unease when eyes meet the gaze of a painted god. In that silence, the curse still breathes, not as fact, but as presence. And so, Chapter 4 continues. In the next part, we will explore why, despite every scientific explanation, the curse refuses to die in popular imagination. Because sometimes, belief itself is more powerful than truth. Chapter 4, Part 3. A legend that refuses to rest. By now, science has given us explanations: mold spores, toxic gases, DNA evidence, CT scans. Archaeologists reassure us that no magical hand strikes down those who disturb the dead. And yet, the curse endures. Why? Part of the answer lies in popular culture. Hollywood's The Mummy, 1932, with Boris Karloff wrapped in linen, created an image so powerful it has never faded. Decades later, new films, From Hammer horror in the 1950s to the blockbuster Mummy franchise of the late 1990s, retold the same story. Disturb the tomb, and the dead will rise in vengeance. Each retelling planted the myth deeper into our collective imagination. Tourism also plays a role. To this day, visitors to Egypt sometimes whisper nervously when entering tombs, their footsteps echoing in narrow passageways. Guides, knowing the power of mystery, lean into the legend. A quiet pause before describing Khanarvan's death. A dimming of flashlights underground. Suddenly, the air feels heavier. Belief sharpens the silence. And then there is the human mind itself. We are drawn to mysteries. We want to believe that ancient civilizations held secrets too powerful to explain. Rationally, we know microbes can kill. But emotionally, it is far more thrilling to imagine the hand of Anubis reaching across millennia. Psychologists tell us this is part of the narrative instinct. We crave stories that explain the unexplainable. A mosquito bite sounds trivial. A pharaoh's curse feels cosmic. When we face uncertainty, death, illness, coincidence, we weave a tale that restores meaning. And few tales are more compelling than the thought of a king guarding his sleep for eternity. Even conspiracy theories keep the curse alive. Some claim governments hide evidence of curses to protect tourism. Others say archaeologists themselves fall under spells they cannot admit. None of these ideas hold up under scrutiny, yet they flourish in books, documentaries, and late-night whispers. So the curse survives. Not because it is real, but because it is useful. It sells papers, fills theaters, guides tourists, and fuels imaginations. It reminds us that even in an age of satellites and DNA, we are still creatures of wonder, still vulnerable to the lure of shadows. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all. The mummy's curse is not carved in stone. It is carved in us, in our fear of death, our fascination with the past, our longing for stories that stretch beyond reason. As Chapter 4 ends, the stage is set for our final descent. In Chapter 5, we will step back and ask the deeper question. What does this legend tell us about ourselves, about the way we live with mystery, and about the strange comfort we find in tales meant to haunt us? For in the end, perhaps the curse was never about Egypt alone. Perhaps it was always about us. Chapter 5, Part 1. The power of belief as we step gently into our final chapter. The sands of Egypt stretch out behind us, tombs, curses, gods, and explorers fading into the distance. What remains is the question that has lingered all along. Did the ancient Egyptians really believe in mummy curses? The answer, as we have seen, is not simple. They did not believe in curses as we imagine them today. Phantoms haunting archaeologists, shadows striking down with unseen hands. What they believed in was deeper, older, and perhaps more powerful. The sanctity of death, the balance of the cosmos, the weight of words. For the Egyptians, death was not an end but a passage. To disturb a tomb was not just theft, it was a fracture in the order of the universe. When they wrote warnings on walls, they were not spinning ghost stories. They were enforcing Ma'at, the principle of balance and truth. In their eyes, the tomb was eternity's doorway, and eternity demanded protection. And yet, belief itself has power beyond culture. Western explorers, unprepared for the psychological gravity of these spaces, read curses where Egyptians wrote prayers. They carried the fear home with them, into newspapers, novels, and films. And once belief took root, it became its own force. Here lies the paradox. The mummy's curse may not be real in the way we imagine it, but its effects, fear, illness, coincidence, even death, are very real. Science gives us words like mold spores and nocebo effect. The Egyptians gave us words like Heka and Mat. Different languages for the same truth. The unseen shapes us. Think of this. A man enters a tomb. He knows the stories. He breathes the heavy air. A week later, he falls sick. Is it bacteria? Is it fear? Or is it both, entwined in ways neither science nor myth can fully separate? And that, perhaps, is why the curse endures. Not because it is a lie, but because it is many truths at once. A truth about Egyptians protecting the dead. A truth about microbes and hidden dangers. A truth about our own imagination, forever drawn to the edges of mystery. As you drift with these thoughts, imagine yourself lying beneath the same stars the Egyptians once saw. Imagine the Nile flowing in silence, pyramids rising like shadows, tombs sealed in the desert's heart. Do you feel the hush? The weight? That is the real power of the curse, not to kill, but to remind us that death, memory, and story are forever intertwined. And as Chapter 5 unfolds, we will let the legend settle into its final form. Not horror, not superstition, but a lullaby of history, a story that guards our sleep, just as the tombs guarded theirs. Chapter 5, Part 2. Mystery as Comfort. What is it about the mummy's curse that lingers in our imagination? It is not only the danger, it is the mystery. And mystery, though it unsettles us, also comforts us in strange ways. Think of the desert at night. The sand cools, the wind carries whispers, and the stars spread endlessly overhead. To the ancient Egyptians, those stars were not distant suns. They were the souls of the dead, shining forever. A tomb was not only a grave, but a promise that one day the deceased would join those eternal lights. For us, living centuries later, the idea of a curse is a way of holding on to that same promise. To believe that a pharaoh still guards his tomb is to believe that the past has not faded. It means that death has not silenced the voices carved into stone. In this way, the curse becomes not a threat, but a reminder that what we do, what we create, and what we believe endures. Science explains. History clarifies. The mystery soothes. When we close our eyes and imagine a golden mask glimmering in torchlight, or painted gods watching from the walls, we feel that we are part of something larger than ourselves. The unknown is frightening, yes, but it is also a blanket, wrapping us in wonder. And that is why people return to this story again and again. The curse does not only belong to the Egyptians. It belongs to us because we need it. We need tales that live in the space between fear and fascination, between knowledge and dream. We need whispers in the dark to remind us that sleep, too, is a kind of journey, a crossing into another world. So, as you listen, let the curse dissolve. Let it become what it always was. Not a threat, but a story. A story carried by sand, by stone, by time. A story told so that you, here and now, might feel the hush of history and the calm of eternity pressing softly around you. Chapter 5, Part 3. The silence of eternity in the end. Perhaps the mummy's curse is not about punishment at all. Perhaps it is about silence. For thousands of years, the tombs of Egypt lay sealed beneath sand and stone. Inside, kings and queens rested in darkness, surrounded by treasures meant not for the living, but for eternity. Each object, a jar of honey, a painted amulet, a carved spell was placed there with care, not to impress us, but to guide a soul beyond death. When we open these tombs, we are not only uncovering artifacts, we are disturbing silence. And silence resists disturbance. To call it a curse is only to give shape to that feeling that perhaps some doors were never meant to be opened, some mysteries never meant to be solved, and yet we open them anyway. We peer into the shadows. We bring cameras and scanners, and we carry the stories home. In doing so, we keep the dead alive, not through magic, but through memory. Every time we whisper about a pharaoh's curse, every time we tell this story, we allow Egypt to breathe again, across oceans and centuries. So maybe the curse is not death, but remembrance. Maybe the curse is that once you hear this story, you cannot forget it. You will always wonder, just a little, about the power of words on stone, about the unseen forces in dark chambers, about the quiet dignity of the dead. And as you lie here, now, listening, eyes growing heavy, you are part of that same chain. You are one more listener in a line that stretches back through time. One more dreamer who has stood at the edge of mystery and let it carry you into sleep. The Egyptians believed that in the Duat, the underworld, the soul traveled through darkness before emerging into the light of dawn. Tonight, as you drift, you too will cross your own Duat from wakefulness into dreams. There are no curses here, only quiet, only the promise of morning. So let the silence of eternity settle around you. Let the story fade into stillness. And let sleep take you, gently, as it once took the pharaohs, as it takes all of us in the end. Chapter 5, Part 4. A good night from the sands, and so our journey ends. We have walked with explorers through the Valley of the Kings, read the words carved into stone by priests long gone, and listened to the gods who guarded eternity. We have weighed science against myth, fear against fascination, and still the truth remains. The mummy's curse is not about death, but about wonder. The sands of Egypt stretch endlessly, covering and uncovering secrets with the breath of the desert wind. Tombs open, treasures gleam, stories rise again. But when the torches are put out and the chambers sealed once more, what remains is silence. A silence that soothes, a silence that invites rest. So now, let the echoes of this story fade. Imagine the Nile flowing softly under the stars, pyramids, dark against the horizon, and the pharaohs sleeping quietly beneath their golden masks. Imagine their guardians, Anubis, Sekhmet, both watching over them, not with vengeance, but with calm. They guard you too as you drift. There are no curses here, only the gentle rhythm of history, the lull of memory, the embrace of night. Close your eyes. Breathe. Let the story become dream. Let the dream become sleep. Good night, traveler of time. May you rest as peacefully as the kings of old.